Hi, my name's Will Seymour and I'm here today to talk about some of the work that I've been doing with my colleagues at King's on developing ethical verbal consent for voice assistants. The concept here is pretty simple. We usually interact with voice assistants, well, verbally, but often when a skill or action requires personal data, you get diverted to a companion app on your smartphone. Instead, these verbal consent mechanisms let you grant permissions without having to use your hands. By moving consent into the conversation, they make the process easier and more accessible. Just a heads up before we move on, we're assuming here that some of the usual suspects like privacy policies are still present to cover all the legal angles. And actually the dual roles that consent is playing here as a legal mechanism and as an ethical best practice is something that I'd like to return to later on. Finally, being based in the UK, we've got a more European perspective on data protection that's based around the GDPR and the UK equivalent. So, to give you a more concrete idea about what this actually looks like in practice, here's the sample transcript from the Alexa Skills Kit documentation. You can see how this is actually a pretty usable conversation flow and integrates quite nicely into the natural way that you progress through the skill. But under the surface, there are some key issues that show how this kind of verbal permissions process, at least as it's currently imagined and implemented, goes against some of the key principles of consent. For instance, if we focus on the core of the consent flow here, where the user is actually asked to give consent, there's this subtle shift as the skill delegates to the Alexa OS. But if you're listening to this as a user, there's nothing to indicate that you're now talking to something controlled by Amazon instead of the third-party skill that you started with. They sound exactly the same, and yet every other major OS takes this kind of differentiation for security and privacy prompts very seriously. And what about the information that you get? If we think about consent in the context of the GDPR, there's obviously a set of details that you absolutely need to include. We get a little bit of that here in the sample text, but when you're also providing a privacy policy, not all of this is legally required. But some pretty key details are missing from the exchange, given that from a practical user perspective, this effectively replaces the graphical alternative that's currently used. Even worse is that because of the way that Amazon lists developer information, even if you make full use of the website and companion app, there's no guarantee that you'll ever be able to find out who has your data. Developer names are self-provided, and research has shown that almost half the privacy policies and skills on the Alexa marketplace are either inadequate or just straight up missing. So your only real option here is to submit feedback to Amazon and hope. And about that last question around withdrawing consent. If you give consent verbally, how do you withdraw it? If you use the conventional permissions flow, you get directed to the companion app, where you have to check the boxes for each type of information that's being requested. And at that point, you know how to get there, and it follows that unticking those boxes later on will stop the data sharing. Great. But if you give consent verbally, then you can't revoke it in the same way. There are no voice commands for that. You've got to find the menu in the app yourself because that's the only way to do it. And the last thing I want to draw attention to is how the structure of conversations with voice assistants adds a background sense of time pressure to conversations. You can see an overview here of the informed consent process for researchers, and one of the key points is that you have as much time as you need to consider and respond. But a fundamental element of conversation with voice assistants is the reprompt. The device asks you a question, and in the case of Alexa, you've got about 8 seconds to respond. Even if you remove this for consent decisions, just using the assistant day to day conditions people to the cadence of conversations in a way that's really difficult to escape. So, identifying problems is great, but what about making things better? There's some obvious stuff that jumps out as a direct response to the things I've been talking about, like restoring symmetry to the consent process by adding new conversation options. Using a different voice for system and security messages seems like a go-to plan, but there are some potential problems with this strategy that have been forecast in the literature since the early 90s around how people perceive and respond to different voices across devices. More recently, studies have also confirmed that users often make little distinction between first and third-party skills, and introducing what might be perceived as a separate new assistant could cause a lot of confusion. But there are also some less obvious things, like leveraging other interaction modalities to deliver some of the information that either isn't well suited to a verbal description or that we simply don't have the time to deliver via speech. We see this to an extent with the current approach, where the legally required notices are hidden away in the GUI. And on this note, the way that we provide access to these mechanisms for developers is also important. Descriptions of why a skill needs personal information should be required by platforms, and Google, for example, already includes this contextual information as part of the permissions API for developers, which in turn signals its importance. Providing actual guidance on what to say would also be a great help, but this might need to come from regulators, as platforms generally try and shift the legal responsibility for using their own APIs correctly onto developers. And finally, I'd like to share some hidden opportunities that arise through taking a step back and critically looking at how we handle data sharing, permissions, and consent for voice assistants. Some examples of this might be breaking away from permissions dialogues, being this Hobson's choice, where declining sets you back to square one. Signposting people with alternatives if they decline to share their information also shifts the incentive back towards this sort of ideal state here where apps and skills only ask for the data that they absolutely need to get the job done. This is also something that could find its way into the algorithms that already shape the usage of these platforms by deciding which results are prioritized when people ask for a skill that is a particular job or fits in a particular category, such as by preferring options that use less data. One interesting concept is potentially being able to make automated decisions for consent based on kind of general user preferences. And this represents one of the sort of more exciting opportunities to reduce the burden on users and make data sharing decisions less adversarial than they currently are, say on the web. And reviewing the structure of voice assistant platforms is something else that could shape the role that consent plays in the overall user experience. Tightening up vetting and certification processes would add an extra line of defense against third-party applications that violate the rules and principles around data protection. The last thing I want to talk about is the importance of disentangling consent as a legal mechanism from the role that consent plays as an ethical best practice. The two don't always need to come together. For most academic research conducted under the GDPR, there's a rigorous informed consent process, but it relies on public interest as the legal basis for data collection. There are also models like dynamic consent that have emerged with the aim of increasing engagement and understanding around data use. The kinds of platforms that voice assistants have become also raises some gnarly questions around who the data controller or controllers are in any given situation. Is it the platform, the developer? What are the legal bases being used for different kinds of data? How does this fit in with developers where they're legally responsible for satisfying data protection regulations, but still have to work within the rigid confines of what platforms allow? In most cases, verbal consent, like I've been talking about today, needs to be backed up with a privacy policy, especially where consent is required by law in order to use data. Current implementations make the process more usable, like voice forward consent for Alexa, but as we've seen, have some pretty serious problems and really miss out on the benefits that consent is capable of bringing as an ethical best practice. This is particularly true around issues of transparency, and in particular helping users to better understand the services that they're using and to express their own privacy preferences. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions about this ongoing line of research, then there's a live Q&A now. And obviously feel free to follow up after the conference via email if you want to discuss anything. Thanks.